Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roberto Fabri, and I am one of the co-author of the publication Modern Architecture Kuwait 4989, along with Sara, Saragoça, and Ricardo Camacho. Now, our guest tonight, starting with Yannis Kitanis, who is an Athens-based practicing architect. Yannis graduated in 2006 from Architectural School of Patras in Greece with a diploma in architecture and is presently teaching design studio there. In 2009, he obtained a master's degree in architecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Besides his architectural practice, Yannis has worked as an assistant in the studio of the Berlin-based artist Warren Nidich and in the climate engineering firm Transolar from Stuttgart for the construction and installation related to this phenomenon. He has been a participant in the Venice Biennale 2010 and 2012 and a lecturer in different institutions in Greece and US. Since 2012, he developed research collaborations through buildings and text, working with major archival resources, including the Konstantinos Doxiadis archive at the Benaki Museum in Greece. Aziz Al-Qatami was named one of the 15 young Arab architects by the Venice Biennale 2012 and by the Institut du Monde Arabe. He is a guest critic at Columbia State University, New York, the Pratt Institute, New York, and Kuwait University. He graduated from the Pratt Institute in 2005, and from Columbia in 2007, after which he worked as a junior architect at the OS Architect in Zurich, 2007-2008. He then worked for the Masafa designers in Kuwait before establishing his own practice in 2009, Atelier Aziz Al-Qatami. Sara Saragoça Soares holds a master's in preservation, building conservation, and urban rehabilitation from the School of Architecture of Lisbon Technical University, where she developed her thesis entitled The Identity of the Modern Heritage, Kuwait City. During her career in Portugal, she focused her practice on building preservation and adaptive reuse. Since 2012, she moved to Kuwait, being involved in the Al Shaid Park development project in Kuwait City for the Amiridi one, and with local organizations, including the National Council for Cultural Art and Letters, where she integrated the curatorial team at the national participation at the Venice Biennale of Architecture 2014, and the national delegation at the 38th session of the World Heritage Committee in Doha, 2014. As an external associate researcher at al-Athar al-Islamiyyah, she is enrolled in the research Modern Architecture Kuwait, being co-author of the publication and the exhibition launched in this year. Like usual, our debate will be moderated by Ricardo Camacho, who's also a co-author of the book and the exhibition, Modern Architecture Kuwait. Please join me in welcoming our moderator and our panelist.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoy. As Roberto said, we slightly changed the panel in order to have a small lecture that somehow brings some context into the discussion and teases the debaters into another dimension. I hope so. So for that, we invited Yannis Kitanis, which was one of our collaborators for the second volume of the book. So Yannis had research on Doxiadis' work and intensively on Doxiadis and Hassan Fathy work in the region. So he will tell us a little bit about that tonight, I hope. And after that, we will proceed with our debate. So I will invite Yannis to come into the podium and to start talking. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank you for having me here, talking about Kuwait and Doxiadis, based on my research that I did for this really interesting book, I think, that is coming out. So, my talk today is called The Evolutionary Identity at the occasion of the Kasaba waterfront by Doxiadis Associates. Kasaba, Ricardo informed me to tell you that is the beach of Ahmadi region, but it's not known as Kasaba. So, but in the project of Doxiadis, everywhere in the archives and in the drawings, it's referred as Kasaba. Anyway, so for the anecdotal information about this thing is that Doxiadis Associates, this huge urban planner from Athens, from Greece, that made projects all over the world, commissioned this project to work for Kuwait in the June of 1975. It was exactly the month that he died, that he passed away. So he was controlling every single of his projects, every project of his, like a control freak. He was all the time over his projects. And for the reason that he wasn't there anymore, I chose to make the research based on an archival research and anecdotal information. So I break up my topic like with anecdotal information and relationships between people, between Doxiadis and collaborators all the time. So I will tackle the problem of identity, of the identity that evolves, the evolutionary identity. I will tackle it in three ways. First of all, based on the identity, based on the typology, on the architectural typology, and the rationalization of the vernacular. And second, based on the form of the city growth. And third, based on the new ecosystems, the new landscapes that coming after the human interaction. So, since the end of late 50s, Doxiadis was commissioned many projects in the Middle East, and he was trusted by almost every Middle Eastern government. These are projects from Iraq, housing in Mosul, and he started having deputies and offices around the Middle Eastern area. At this, At the same time, in order to systematize all these modern procedures, all this automation of imposing huge amounts of houses, of public spaces, really large plans, he had developed a system, a method, which is called acoustics. So the acoustics was like an approach, the first interdisciplinary approach towards social sciences, economics, cultural disciplines, technical disciplines, political sciences. And he named this acoustics for the sake of, he wanted to develop a new science in order to assist architecture and urban planning. At this point, it was he collaborated with Hassan Fathy, is this really famous Egyptian architect. So that he was expelled from Egypt during the Nasser regime, and Doxiadis knew him and he admired him. So he called him and asked him to be collaborators. So Fathy did. He went to Athens and started the collaboration. And Fathy became his, let's say, his deputy in Iraq, in Jordan, in Lebanon. And he went there and conducted research upon the sun movements, the ventilation, and all the techniques that the traditional Arab architects used to use, or the masons were using in order to achieve the best results for every region that they were building. So, and he was doing all these studies, and he was looking about the Bagdir, how the air penetrates the building, and he was making very elaborate facades, as you see on the upper right of the board. At the end of the day, in the Doxiadis office, they were simplifying the drawings, but they were using his achievements. It's interesting to refer at this point that Fathy was also researching for Greek islands. He was considering that Greek islands also belonged to the Mediterranean and the Middle East belong to the same cultural and geographical region, and one has take from the other and formulate a common language upon upon their architectural dialogue. So finally, this is the project that I have for Kuwait. The Doxiadis associates finally were moving in the same direction. They were using the vernacular elements, not in an iconic way, but in a way that it was absorbing the knowledge from many years ago. I mean, it was almost scientific. If you have tested for ages some practices and then you implement it, it belongs totally to the eichistic approach that Doxiadis has developed, to the multidisciplinary approach. Although the aesthetic of the thing, if you see, this is the Saba waterfront in the chalet in the region of the coast region of Ahmadi, let's say, that have a contemporary vocabulary. The quality is not that good because they're old images, but you see, it has something from the past which takes only the good and the scientific tested things from the tradition. So this is the first approach that what I'm calling evolutionary identity in terms of typology and architectural language. It doesn't stick to the past, but it proceeds. The second aspect of the evolutionary identity that I want to refer is the shape of the future growth of the city that Doxiadis was proposing. It is interesting to refer here that after the World War II, Doxiadis, after he fought, he became the deputy of the Greek prime minister that had to restore Greece from the devastations of the war. So he documented everything. He made an extremely meticulous research upon every possible thing that was devastated from the war. Here I have a diagram that shows only it's in Greek, but you might understand from the graphic. He has diagrams even from the animals that got killed during the war and domesticated animals, and people cannot get food or couldn't work with it. So he made a book and he catalogued the situation of Greece during that time and how could we restore this thing. So this was his agenda from the very first days of his practice. When he finally left the ministry and he became a practicing architect and urban planner, this idea never left his mind. He wanted to make it bigger. So he organized the Athens Technological Institute. This institute was an organization that would have to collect data from all over the world and interpret the cities based on their data. So for this reason, I found a really interesting letter he was sending to Dr. Saba George Siber, the Palestinian-American urban planner that was commissioned here at the same time to make master plans and to document all the characteristics of Kuwait. So I have their correspondence. So Doxiadis is sending him a big questionnaire and asking him to complete it with topological, with topographical, with cultural, religious, everything, to make a list out of it. So the Doxiadis associates have a clear image of what is going on in case they have a project later in the area. So, but the answer from Saba George Sieber came much later for the reason that he was hospitalized, suffering a severe heart attack, as he describes it. And he literally sent the questionnaire empty, when just a few questions answered. But that was not the end of the story. Saba George Sieber, without any invitation, when he recovered, a couple of years later, he sent this volume with a letter, and it still exists in the archives of Doxiadis in Athens, saying that you will find everything here, everything that you need. So they started the debate, the dialogue, without having any commission in Kuwait, just having a setup of a database of what is going on in every city. And this is the Kuwaiti case. So with Doxiadis, Saba George Sieber was sharing the same attitude towards what is going on in the cities. They were criticizing all the geometric paper plans that foreign companies that have nothing to do with the context that were realizing all over the globe. I mean, corporates from all over, from America, from Britain, they were realizing projects that were not sensitive in terms of context. So both Saba George and Sieber and Doxiadis were afraid that all the cities would grow radially and that the core will explode at some point. So they have similar also taste in terms of how do you perceive the medieval city in general, and how do you learn from it. Saba George was complaining all the time that the new urban planners don't learn anything about the organic medieval Arab town, and the new schemes are really strict and really out of context, and they raise everything. Doxiadis, with the same attitude, was telling stories in his lectures. He was lecturing all the time about, for example, Constantinople, Istanbul, back then Constantinople, had the same fortification for something like 1,000 years. It never expanded. It was there. Everything was really well thought out, and everything was placed in a certain position for a very important reason. And also, he favored to use the paradigm, the example of Michelangelo with David in Piazza della Signora in Florence, I'm sorry, where Michelangelo was living there, and one night he appeared and he left the statue, David, and he had the commission, of course, but he left it without revealing it in a really important celebration and so on. So that the residents would come there and leave paper notes in order to vote if the statue was good for this place or not, like a referendum, let's say. So he liked very much this story. But anyhow, the osmosis, the interaction of these men, the sad thing is that came after their death, both. Saba George died something like 2 years after this dialogue, and Doxiadis died 10 years later in 1975. And as I told you in the beginning, the very first month that he passed away, the office was commissioned to make the plan for the Saba area. And so he had the idea of having a residential development with no... Sorry, he didn't have the idea, he wasn't there. But the associates had the idea that they would develop in a grid, in a triangular axis, so that they have maximum. Can I have light here? So no, it doesn't have light. This one. Okay, not laser around. Thank you. Yeah, it's okay. These triangles are where the plots. So all those things were maximized. The facade of the plots were maximized in order to achieve more view to the sea, taking in advantage the close distance. And this was the center of the area. So talking about the future growth that I was talking before and the evolution of the city in time. So he had an idea. He had the idea that the thing should grow only through the landscape, not sprawling all over through the sectoral desert or through in random places. So he developed the concept of resilience, that the city starts from this 3 kilometers thing and goes not radially, but in the coast. It grows like this, like a lava that flows in the landscape. So these are some diagrams, and Doxiadis favored to check out the master plans from a really good position, like a god. So about the landscape now, about how do you change the microclimate, and you see the evolutionary change in the local circumstance by affecting the soil itself. So, and it's important to talk about this also here. So Doxiadis believed that the Earth would be covered at some point like a biomorphic fluid, like a lava from the universe, with cities. He was telling that we should not be afraid of the huge cities, because it was already a fact. You had already huge cities back in the 70s. But he was strongly believing that all those really, really interconnected spaces should have centers. Centers with walking distances, with reduced use of the car, with really humane situation there. So in order to conceptualize all these separate poles, these different things, he invented the term of entopia, which is like utopia, and reality, dream and everyday life. So he always wanted to achieve those two things at the same time, being realistic and being utopic. For this reason, this lady is Jacqueline Tyrwhitt, is his consultant in landscape matters. She came from Harvard. She was teaching at Harvard, and then she became her partner at the office to consult him in every landscape project that he had all over the world. So he got a house while he was working for Doxiadis in the mountains around Athens. That was her dream. A little glimpse of Aegean Sea and pure nature. So he bought the house, and with a self-financing system, he bought all the plots around it. And she made it to have a law that no fence would be allowed to be there, and no other houses would be built except one-story buildings in every plot around. And that was a postcard on the right that he was sending to her friends when she was inviting them to spend the summer. But of course, she was British. She didn't know very well the Greek climate, and she realized finally that during the summer that she was inviting her friends, that wasn't the paradise. It was really, really hot, and everything was yellow and brown, and not really paradise. So her technical assistance and her idea of what I'm talking about, what I'm telling about entopia before, was that she wanted to acclimatize the landscape of Greece, of Athens. So it's not it's arid, of course, but it's green. So she gathered information about plants and trees from all over the world, tropical things, tropical plants, and she managed to make this garden in Attica, in Athens, a really lush garden during the summer months, really, really rich, really, really green. So no matter what the climate is, you can moderate, you can make it more moderate if you intervene. And this is also the case of Ahmadi, and that's why I'm putting it after this, because in the middle of the desert, the British oil company, managed to have a garden city in a really harsh desert environment. And that's also the idea in the same waterfront that I was talking to you before, in the Unkasaba waterfront. It has fingers, starting from the sea, going up the hills, fingers of trees of foreign species that would stand the intense sunlight. And I would like to close with this: no matter what the landscape is, and no matter what the tradition, the history you bring in your back, and of course Greece has huge of tradition and a very particular landscape and certain urban characteristics, you as an architect or as an urban planner, you modify it in a way that you avoid piecemeal social engineering if you're an urban planner, or the huge gesture if you're an architect, and you always are in the position that you synthesize nature, man-made and natural, and space. Yeah. This is for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this presentation was quite inspiring for what's coming next. But I just wanted to do a small, before we start the questions, we will just go over a small context of where these questions come from. So, after the independence of Kuwait, the emphasis was on functional zoning. The resolution of an architectural image is defined as a tentative to represent national pride and identity on every domain, from the institutional buildings to domestic architecture. However, the efforts to give the city a new face have started 1 year earlier with the Facade Committee for Fahad al-Salem Street in 1960. The boulevard connecting the Jara Gate to Safat was still related to the traditional city, understanding as a finite physical entity controlled by a geometric order where street facades are flat elements to be beautified. Intentional or not, Sabah George Shiver made an important inversion on this process. While at the Department of Public Works, the Palestinian-American architect and planner developed a site-specific urban scheme within Kuwait Master Plan Grid. The city became a fluid structure negotiated at any number of speeds, subject of fluctuations of resources, and linked by countless visible and invisible infrastructures, such as shade or commercial cooperation. The new build in the city's central business district became part of a common urban scape that defined the modern town navigation systems through the combination between buildings and public realm. So this gives you a kind of a background in our point of view, and I'm talking on behalf of the three co-authors of the book and exhibition, about how the image of this city was pursued in the beginning of the modernization process. So this is basically what we will discuss today, but considering how relevant this discussion is to understand what is today Kuwait and what can be Kuwait tomorrow. The water and power distribution supply network, first completed in 1953, rendered two conditions that were particular to the pre-existing mosque, but not yet recognized as a planning tool. The role of landmarks, reference elements in the cityscape by their size, nature, and or shape, such as the former water tower in Safat, for instance, and the idea of a grid as a form of territorial control, such as the network of highways and roads that remain to these days. Some of these modernization artifacts, as we call them, have eventually remained as the constituent elements of a system that defines the urban hierarchies inside the capital, inside Kuwait. Are there any other elements, either built or not, that may have substituted those, imposing a new order of urban references that can substitute the previous ones once these are demolished?
Landmarks are really important in the urban landscape, mainly after the demolition of the old city. They act as reference points that help us to guide in a certain urban context. Kuwait City was developed under an inflexible road network. So we can find those landmarks at the major junctions and roundabouts. Certainly, the choice to allocate the first public buildings on these locations was not random, where they can be easily perceived by cars, showing the desire of modern city.
Thank you.
Thank you, al-Athar, for inviting me, and Ricardo for conducting all of that. Monuments they're quite hard to quantify, but like the water tower transformation from its function to a monument, I think the second ring road had a very interesting role in transformation, where it transformed from being like this functional road into the idea of Shara al-Hub, or Love Street, and it got injected with this new program of cruising, people watching. The land changed itself. The Mamsha became like completely different from a highway. It changed itself from a highway to a promenade or boulevard, let's say.
So each one of our guests just talked about two completely different contexts, but of course interrelated, that define this idea of what are the entities or the built elements that define the hierarchies in the city. So our second question is, are these building hierarchies or spatial hierarchies, let's say, important to maintain the city attractive, serving the purpose of a city infrastructure that enables its citizens to afford a certain life pattern, or can this be replaced by any other system at any other moment? Sara?
For me, they cannot be replaced because these buildings are public. So, and public buildings, they perform a function that the private sector cannot easily achieve. Removing them would undermine urban hierarchies and public uses, which are fundamental to city diversity and for state recognition. The major private initiatives follows business motivations and within the office tower typology. So the hierarchies are more difficult to recognize. So I think they should not be replaced or remove it.
It's hard to replace it because I think like this image, like this Ethiopian Le Corbusier plan versus Genève Doha Tower. It creates memory, it marks territory, and it's quite macho and very strong. It's aggressive and it marks its territories, but it's needed for creating memory and for like having solid experiences versus the plan of Le Corbusier.
So we were just looking at kind of three different landmarks, either in Kuwait or Doha. But are these buildings relevant to the country's material and cultural identity? And what are the means that justify such arguments? Can new elements, in the absence of these buildings, we can call them old in the case of the old Ministry of Guidance and Municipality, perform as the constituents of a contemporary society founded on values of consumption and leisure, entertainment, away from the 1960s state institution representative environment? Sara?
The old buildings, they represent, of course, a certain period of time of Kuwait, the post-oil modernization, and for me, none of any period should be deleted from the history of from the urban history of a country. Also, they are the face of its intervenients. They are the face of the ruler of that time, of the decision makers, and also of the architects. So when the last decision makers will disappear, if the buildings will disappear, also it will be like a hole, an empty space. Also, a consumption society is based on the private initiative that seeks profit and is not based on cultural or even urban values. All their buildings work as independent objects on the urban fabric, as we can see here in the Alhambra Tower, in comparison to the cinema that was on the same space. We can understand the meaning of a public space between a public building and a private one.
Perfect.
So this is a project, I did the architecture of it. It's called Mandil Mahmed. It's a video projected inside of this theater, and it's literally taking consumption into a monumental idea, literally. And it's about the act of this constant temporal consuming community. And you see it like in the video, which is done by Khalid Al-Gharibali and Fatima Al-Qadiri, and then the architecture is done by me and Nan Al-Hamad. And yes, it's like it is a consumption consumer role, but at the same time you see like in relation to that too, when the arrival of Marina Mall happened in Salmiya, you see around it a huge area. It's like equivalent to the size of it, like a fungus of organic growth shisha cafes sprawling around it. And I think without this like capitalist universal enterprise of like Marina Mall, this didn't happen to accompany it.
Thank you. Through the distribution of the oil revenues, the state subsidized housing programs that allowed for, in the words of Saba Shiber, the assertion of an affluent individualism over all other urban forms, and which produced the individual large house. Saba Shiber classified these buildings as structural misconceptions or paradoxes of good architecture. can you both elaborate on these paradoxes and how one can recognize such misconceptions?
I think many of these houses, there are here two examples, were designed to provide an image of the modern, like to be modern. But they didn't really represent that status. Because at the end, they don't use the free plans, they don't respond to function motivations. They work more as a collage of different reference of modern buildings that they took from external sources, and they try to work as a college in a single house. So
I think the idea of a plot in general, it's an anti-urban, it's isolated, it creates a bubble, and it's like semi-suburbia. And when I was moving from New York to Zurich, I worked on a huge project, and it's the extreme opposite of what I'm doing right now. And I think it has a lot of effect because when I started coming back to Kuwait, it was like a huge computer building for IBM and Novartis, which is the largest pharmaceutical company. So when I moved back, that has nothing to do with, it's all about data and things. I moved back, and then I looked at the situation in Kuwait. We housed ourselves in this urban condition. This is Atelier Aziz Al-Qatami. When we first started, this is the one that we won for the Young Arab Architect from Institut du Monde Arabe and Venice Biennale. And we started this dialogue, re-evaluating the urban setting in a more denser area and moving from there.
Now we are getting to serious stuff. So, do you believe that such kind of domestic culture became dominant and eventually affected the overall architectural production in Kuwait? Did it affect the national public building programs? Do these references build the contemporary mainstream, imposing themselves to public infrastructure and to the idea of collective hierarchies of the cityscape? Sara.
Yes, in Kuwait is known like everyone has a designer inside. Each of us there is a designer. So most of the locals they had and they still have an active role in building their house. In many cases, they assume the designer function. So these people are the same people when in charge of raising public buildings. They will use the same approach, the same special approach as they have towards their house. So on my reference image, we can think that this is a house, but it's not. It's a waiting area in the airport with a window that leads to nowhere. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, I think they, I'm not sure, but I think they this question I'm not sure about, because I think you might have another way, because I'm not sure. I think they coexisted at the same time. I don't know if they affected it or not. This photo is Phnom Penh in Cambodia by Van Molivan, and I think it's a global wave that happened at that time that showed like that we want to be modern, and it's like part of the trend of the developing global south, and it's part of being independent and post-colonial. So,
thank you. Mm-hmm. So, agreeing or not, we can continue with this idea of what are, like, trying to search for what are the entities that define the building production in Kuwait. So the emphasis on building and their material and technological performances, which is other dimension of this kind of modern optimistic spirit, has been the central object model to inform the architectural and urban design processes since Ahmedi Foundation. Does this lead to the enforcement of production, material and fabrication over the building use, program, typology, and even urban context and concept?
Sorry, I got a little bit lost. Can
I
you
start?
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, in some cases, but like an example, like in the building that we are in right now, al-Islamiyyah in Yarmouk, it reappropriated itself as a space concept driven into a program rather than and re-inhabiting an existing structure which is quite rigid and harsh, and to reutilize it. I think it's seen as a different way right now by utilizing this building.
I think building program in Kuwait, it's a rare exercise. Usually the building is much more focused on its image, even outside and also indoor in the common areas. Designing concerns are often related with cladding materials and furniture, and not with the special organization, the special needs, the working process, the working environment. So on this example, it's a good example that I think it's a man's dream building. I never saw such organized building in Kuwait, such clean building. It's really wonderful, but at the same time, it's an empty building. So there is offices that are not occupied. So it raises the question if the building was made despite the program, if the program exists, or is just to show an image, just to accomplish a dream of someone.
Thank you. So was modernization brought into the public building production through material and technological assumptions, or does it produce relevant spatial conditions that impact the construction of a national existence and the recognition of its historic and environmental contexts? Building complexes such as the Ministries complex with the SME outdoor areas in between the Ministries building and the Port Authority as a metaphor to the seafair tradition can eventually be understood as such?
Yes, I think Ministries complex and a few others that you commented on are quite, they have all of these qualities by adapting. And this is another example. It's a mosque or prayer room. It's in Tehran, Namazi Khan by Kamran Diab Architects. And the interesting about it that it's respecting the sensitive to typology. It's the urban grid, and at the same time accommodating and addresses the hyper localness of the need and the idea of qibla. So it's negotiating both things at the same time.
Thank you.
Is this one? Yes. So I think the Ministries complex is a shift on the design process of the early stages. The main idea now is not focused on the material here, neither on the technology of construction, but more on the concept. So they use the typology of the souk in order to solve a relation between the different ministries, working as the Met building proposed by the Smithsons on their plan of 1969.
Thank you. So John Aries was commissioned, and we talked about John Aries in the previous section, for the building research laboratories in Kayfan. Out of these laboratories, an extensive program of research into the use of building materials in hot, dry climates over the coming years was conducted, leading to the establishment of a local manufacturing industry. From the national industries company Limestone Bricks to the recent phenomenons of Sigma paints and aluminium cladding, the local source ability of construction materials has shaped an aesthetic sensibility for building.
As an architect who's practicing, I find a lot of range of clients coming to me and asking me to do a lot of things, and part of it is they ask me to do architecture as an event, like with a theme or with a temporary effect. And at the same time, I'm part of an art collective called GCC. We're 8 members, and we work all over the world, producing a lot of work, and we're interested in the contemporary image of the Arabian Gulf. And re-examining all of these moments. And especially, we're interested in a lot of architectural and systems in general. So this is Topocelia. We showed it in Sharjah Art Foundation. It's commissioned by Sharjah Art Foundation. And Topocelia is it's a word, combined word between two words, ceiling and topophilia, which is the strong sense of a place. And it's derived from one of the palaces. We took like partially the design of the ceiling, and we tried to replicate it, but in a modification. And the table, it's quite 1 to 12 scale of the real scale table of that is existing in one of the palaces. And we're examining this sense of design or the idea of floodlights all over the place, gypsum board, even the idea, not just in this piece, even the idea of, I think, a Lucabon or Sigma that you mentioned. I think they're underestimated and people take it for granted as something cheap or as something that should be looked down on, but I think these materials should be re-examined and revisited, and they might lead to a vernacular way of doing something more developed.
Now we are in the right slide, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now we are. So at the first stage, the design process was deeply related with the material condition. So because of that, in Kuwait, they opened a research laboratory building, which was very progressive at the time and the only one on the Gulf region, where they could test the materials on such hot and dry climate. On this presentation of the project, on the architectural review, we can see how deep is the description of the construction methodology of the building. But with the advent of new cladding materials, as the Aluka bond, materiality is not anymore related with the shape, with the volume of the building, and does not interfere on the design process. So that's why we can see a building made of stone that was designed to have a stone cladding will be completely cladded with a Aluka bond. And for sure, if we think about the a building projected to use a Aluka bond, we will not design a building like this. So with a Aluka bond, the special organization of a building, its volume, its shape, is completely detached of the exterior image.
Thank you. So, getting back to Yannis Kitanis and Doxiadis, in this letter to Salvador Schieber, there was a very relevant subject, which was the introduction to this idea of a city for the future. So, in the questionnaire that Yannis was talking about, the answer to that questionnaire of Salvador Schieber was, in his words, as catchy as the new image of Kuwait in its fluid city shell. So, Schieber questionnaire, as Yannis already told us, was blank. If you would be asked today by Doxiadis to do the same thing that once was asked to Schieber, what would be the parameters, or how you would approach this subject?
I think we became more sophisticated in dealing with the idea of the future, or like projecting to the future. I think the future is now, and it's like we examine what we have and then we move forward with it than projecting on like what they used to do before. I think it's like looking at the pyramid, not top to bottom, bottom to up. It's like those huge, massive projects, and more like Dubai, Doha style developments, opera houses, museums. It has something amazing. It's like create jobs. It activates the site, but on the long run, if it doesn't have, it's not sustainable. If it doesn't have this flux of force of money that's coming in it, it won't maintain itself. The other option is like what's happening in Kuwait City right now. And this is a project that I worked on called Volume 1. And it has, like, there's all these like small businesses that it's opening up in different areas of Kuwait, and they're preserving the site and injecting new program and regenerating a different movement in the area. And I think by going like bottom up, it's like you create the tectonics of gentrification.
Thank you. Sara.
I'm a little bit like Shiba. That's why it's white my page, because I think it's a very difficult question. But since Aziz told that the future is now, for me, if the future is now, is the present. And I think to think about the future, we need to think about our past.
Yeah.
And to think about our past is to make measures of the city. So we need to understand what is the building stock. We need to understand if we can reuse that buildings, and if they can be imposed in the ready-made solutions. And we need to understand the different communities and how they can relate. And the further K are the building codes and how they can improve the city life.
Thank you. So we are in our last question, and after we will have some questions also from that side. So Sabah Shiba was not able to find solutions for, at the end of the day, the original scene of Kuwait City, the demolition of the old traditional city. Can you trace any similarity between the demolition of the old city of Kuwait upon the first master plan and the eventual demolition of the buildings that are in that exhibition right in the other side?
No, it's constant. We have the image is Jannat al-Mu'alla cemetery, Maqbara in Mecca, before and after. And I might be wrong, but I think it's a constant thing that it's part of the nature of the surroundings, is destroying things and reburning, creating things and keep on destroying them. And I think, as what you mentioned in the book, many of these buildings have been demolished. And but of course, it's more complex than this linear only image of this is the end, it's temporary, and it's the nature of the surrounding. It has to do with economy, it has to do with the value. Me as an architect, I talk to a lot of people trying to save buildings. I can do some of them, but the others, I cannot calculate the same amount of money by what they have by destroying it. But I think it has to do mainly with nature, with economy, and with the lack of the visual language that we have in tradition until now, and the lack of sentimentality, and this idea of hygiene and cleaning everything all the time. And the city, it's like the Kleenex again. It's the city, it's part of it. It's being temporary.
Thank you. Sara, I will ask you to be very brief because we are off of time.
The only relation that I can do, that I think now the demolition of this building is even worse than was before.